From controversial MP to disgraced villain. This is the story of how Renaldo Gouws was exposed for his racism and what it means for the deeper debate and the deeper fight for racial equality and racial justice in South Africa. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX if you're new around here. My name is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. Thank you for helping us get to over 100,000 subscribers. Next stop, 200K. Okay, so we cannot avoid this Renaldo Gouws scandal. And I've been taking my time to comment on it because firstly, I just wanted to get a sense of all the facts. You can get carried away with narratives on social media, and then it becomes clear that those narratives are inaccurate or untrue. But I think we have a factual basis to go on. And in today's episode, I want to discuss, number one, what the background to this Renaldo Gouws suspension is, because he's been suspended by his party and he's been disgraced as someone who's made shocking, terrible, horrendous racial comments. Now, I want to talk about the background, but then and after that, and I think this is the much more important part of the video, I want to talk about the broader question of racial equality and racial justice in South Africa, because I think it's really at the base of all that is happening in our politics right now, with this talk of governments of national unity and a sense in which the struggle for racial justice and the struggle for racial liberation in South Africa, which is one of the most noble and ethical struggles in the world, has in some ways been overlooked as we rush to create a government, and we need to reintroduce the importance of racial equality and racial justice and racial liberation in South Africa today. So if you've heard about this Renaldo Gouws thing, but you're not exactly sure what's happening, let me give you an update and a primer, but also explain why this is important. So Renaldo Gouws becomes a member of parliament in this most recent parliament. I actually saw him from a distance when I was at the first sitting, and I was like, no way, is this guy became a DA MP. Like, I knew he was somehow connected to the party, but I had no idea that they had actually taken this decision to put him in the highest legislative body in the country. And I think it poses very fundamental questions about the DA's selection process. So Gouws is notorious, and has been for a long time, for attempting to style himself as some kind of radical free speech activist. But what it really means is giving himself the latitude to make offensive and egregious statements about any number of people who are different to him and get away with it, at least until now. So someone like Dan Corder on his show, and shout out to him, did a very good job of explaining some of the different things that Gouws has said, from mocking Mbongi at Parliament, trying to suggest that African languages can be reduced to babble talk, to and this one really gets me, comparing democratic South Africa and its constitutional legislation that empowers Black South Africans to at least reach a stage of equality with their white counterparts, to the crime against humanity that was apartheid. And I'm going to get into this in more depth, because this seems to be some kind of defense mechanism for racists, where they try to accuse their accusers while ignoring the very obvious evil of apartheid and its legacy, which reaches not just into the present, but will reach into the future. He compared these laws for justice and reparation to apartheid itself, saying Black people were beaten during apartheid, now white people are beaten. And Black people were discriminated against, now white people are being discriminated against. Nonsense. We'll get into that exactly why later. But just to give you a sense of what he said. Quote, "Viva struggle, viva F the white man. If Africa had to disappear off the face of the earth tomorrow, no one would effing notice." And in addition to these comments, before we get on to the worst video, which just closed the case, Gouws, like many other people, and I think Gouws is part of a much broader network that we need to disentangle and uncover. And if we really had an investigative media in South Africa that didn't just focus on ANC factional battles, maybe they would do the hard work of actually uncovering racial injustice and showing the networks of racism that exist in the South African digital media landscape. But no, they won't. They'll just focus on, if it bleeds, it leads, crime stories and ANC intrigue. Thanks for watching SMWX. Before we get back to the episode, I just wanted to let you know the 4 ways that you can help support this channel if you want to see us growing bigger and better to keep you more entertained and informed. The first way is you can invite me to speak at your company, your school, your institution. You'll see the contact details down below. The second way is that you can become a member of this channel. Become a member, or you can give us a thanks. You'll see there's like a heart with a $sign in the ribbon below this video. Buy me and the team some coffee for this episode. The third way you can get involved is you can advertise on the channel. Now, I'd much rather the community of viewers would be advertisers on this channel than me going out to people who don't really know about SMWX and trying to explain it to them. So if you're a viewer and you have a business and you want to partner and you love this platform, let's partner on this channel. And then finally, you can buy merchandise, you can buy books. All this is in the description down below. Now let's get back to the episode. If you look at social media, Gouws has been one of these antagonists who will attack personally anyone who stands up for and becomes vocal about questions of racial justice in an attempt to browbeat and denude of confidence anyone who stands up and makes these issues important on the public stage, which they are. I mean, I've been a regular target of Gouws, along with my father, and he seems to put us together in these weird posts he seems to be very irritated at the fact that I went to Oxford and says that this is some kind of inconsistency. Well, okay, Mr. Gouws, I didn't go to Hoërskool Domkop, where you probably graduated from, but I don't see why I should feel ashamed of getting a scholarship to one of the best universities in the world. Anyway, back to the narrative. Gouws constantly attacks people who disagree with him on social media in these bad faith ways, and then turns himself into a victim if he gets a taste of the same medicine. And so we saw that in the way that he responded to the way this initial scandal broke out. Now, when we hadn't seen this video, which he deleted from his social media accounts, but which IOL, I believe, was able to go back and uncover, and subsequently people have brought out the full context of the video and verified that it at this stage seems to be genuine, even though there were denials and there was a suggestion it could be AI generated. The first thing Gouws did before that later video came out was just the usual strategy, condemn anyone that felt offended by these obviously offensive comments. He said, please drink a Panado for the chest pains if a video from 16 years ago offends you. He subsequently deleted that, but that was clearly the way he felt about it. And many people came to his aid saying, this was only 16 years ago, don't be so offended, and an attempt once again to try and turn the onus back onto those who rightly condemned the statements rather than actually focusing on the statements themselves, which are the real subject. Now, we saw some quite shameful comments after that. Let's start with the DA, which basically remained mute, the ANC, which remained mute, and then we had John Steenhuisen, who was asked about this at the inauguration before the final video came out, and he said, these remarks must be seen in their context. Now, let's stop there. What context? What kind of context would justify these kinds of remarks? Is there a context in which it's okay to ridicule African language and culture Is there a context in which comparing apartheid to democracy is appropriate? Is there a context in which saying if Africa disappeared, I don't know what that disappearance means, that no one would notice? So I'm not sure what context Mr. Steenhuisen is referring to. He then repeated Gouws' line of defense, which was, it was 16 years ago. And we're going to get into this 16 years ago thing, because I'm interested in what matters 16 years ago and what doesn't matter 16 years ago. And if we're going to have any sane moral debate, we cannot have a 16-year cutoff point, because many things that happened 16 years ago are relevant today. The DA is pursuing many political causes whose origin is far, far older than 16 years. And you can't cut things off 16 years ago for racists, but not for everyone else who you happen to like. So 16 years ago is irrelevant. And then he says, when people are young, he actually wasn't that young. I believe he's in his early 40s now, or he's just turned 40, or maybe late 30s. So 16 years ago is not young. And when people are young and irresponsible, so in their mid-20s, they're young and irresponsible. Well, okay, circular, but what does that mean? Does being young give you the license to say racist things? And if that is the position and that's the policy, then tell us to our faces, rather than using these terms which exonerate and create impunity. Is this a government of national unity or a government of national impunity? Because if it's going to rely on impunity for racism, then you can count me out. Gayton McKenzie came out at this point and said, no, we can't cancel Mr. Gouws. It was 16 years ago. It's wrong what he said, but we can't punish him. He later walked that back and apologized when another video came out confirming the case of racism. But shameful that people try to deflect and avoid accountability. In this society, it's like people get held accountable for every single thing, except when it comes to being racist. Then accountability suddenly becomes elusive. Then a new video came out. And this video, I'm not even going to repeat really a lot of what was said, but Gouws uses the absolute most egregious terms and tries to basically advocate for people, and especially white people, being able to say that black people, in the worst terms used for them, both of the worst terms used, like how do you use both of the worst terms locally and internationally, should be able to advocate for the murder of black people. And the reason he says this is that there's a struggle song called Kill the Boer, which can be equated to him posting on his YouTube channel that black people should be killed and murdered. It's one of the most morally depraved videos I have ever had the displeasure of watching. It's one of the most intellectually bereft and ethically misguided things that you will ever see on the face of this earth. And I don't know what's worse, the evil of it or the stupidity of it. And when you combine stupidity and evil, you get a toxic cocktail of Mr. Gouws' ideology, all trying to be hidden behind the language of sarcasm. There was nothing sarcastic about this video, by the way. The language of deflection and the language of instigation. So this terrible video comes out, and what does Gouws do? Runs away, tries to say he doesn't remember it. How do you not remember saying something like that? And then what else doesn't he remember if he doesn't remember this? Does he have a bad memory? Because then I wonder about his capacity as a parliamentarian. If he can't remember things from 2010, then maybe he should get that checked out. Because we need people with good memories in parliament, people who can remember doing egregious and unlawful things. So I hope that his memory returns to him soon, because he might need to use that memory in some of the accountability litigation that is no doubt building up. So that's where we are. And what happens with that? Gayton McKenzie retracts. He says he was sorry for defending Gouws. The DA stays silent for a long time. The ANC is still silent. And then the DA releases a statement calling this execrable language. Execrable, fam? Racist would have done. A shout out to Clement Manyatela, who on his show speaks to a DA representative who says, why execrable? Like, you really dug into the dictionary for that one when there was a very easy, simple word to use. And he says, why don't you just call it racist? And the DA representative says, well, if you want me to call it racist, no, sir, it's not about wanting you to call it racist. It's about you taking ownership for racism and for calling a thing, calling it what it is. It's not execrable. It's execrable that you can't use the term racist. It's racist, and it needs to be called out as such. And if we can't have honest conversations about what constitutes egregious and obvious racism, then we're not even out of the starting blocks towards equality and justice in our society. Shout out to the South African Human Rights Commission, who have announced that they are going to be taking this obvious example of racial hate speech to the Equality Court. And I think that's a great step to ensure accountability so that people who have these racist intentions, who are never going to change, at least are held accountable, and that the victims of these outbursts know that there's not just impunity for saying these and doing, because remember, these thoughts and these deeds are often backed up by action. This is someone who wanted to write laws for South Africa, to participate in the highest level of political debate and turn these thoughts into action. And those who perpetuate racist speech and racist action must know that there will be consequences. In many countries in the world, there aren't consequences for these kinds of things. But South Africa is different. South Africa must be a country where there are consequences. And I'm glad that the Human Rights Commission has ensured that there is some legal accountability here. Okay, so that's the Gouws story. But quite frankly, the Gouws story is not what interests me, because Gouws is just the tip of the iceberg. Gouws represents a much deeper problem and a much more important conversation that we, who are not extremists and racism denialists, actually need to have. And I think that's the vast majority of South Africans, right, from across the racial spectrum. We need to talk about racism in South Africa and racial equality and racial justice. And it's my great fear that if we fail to have this conversation, which we've been delaying and postponing for 30 years, one day we're going to reach a point where our failure to have these conversations and to enter into real exchange on this conversation is going to come back to haunt this country. It already haunts this country in terms of the living conditions and the lived experience of the vast majority of this country. But if we don't grapple with racial inequality, then we really have another thing coming as a country. So in this section, I want to talk about some of the tactics that are used by an extreme minority to elevate their voice and try to dissuade people from talking about racial justice, and why those tactics are absolutely intellectually bankrupt. And then I want to talk about why there's a need to impose accountability for racism more widely on South African society, and ultimately why any government or any powerful institution in this country has to take as one of its priorities, if not the priority, questions of racial reparation, questions of racial justice, and racial equality. Because once we get that right, many of our society's other problems, which actually stem from this deeper problem, also resolve themselves. So we can't just look at the surface, we need to look at the root. We can't just look at the leaves, we need to look at the root. Now, those who wish to perpetuate racism in South Africa have a series of tired defenses. The first is to deny the existence of racism. or what I'll call racism denial. They'll actually say that racism doesn't exist, that anyone who even talks about it is the problem rather than the problem of racism itself. And in doing so, they try to gaslight society into ignoring what is right in front of our faces. And they try to diminish the voices of those who talk about race and use the language of racism against those who talk about race, when in fact it's racism denialists who actually are the true racists. Because denying the existence of racism and racial inequality is itself a form of racism. It's an attempt to deny the experience of those who suffer racism and thereby suppress the reality of that in service of an agenda of racial superiority. And so this is why it's always important to continue to talk about this issue and to continue not to be gaslit into the assumption that race disappeared when democracy started in South Africa. How was the apartheid government able to see race for so long? And how were those who perpetuated racism and benefited from it and used racist violence and racist laws against black people, how were they able to see race for so long? And then suddenly when democracy started, they weren't able to see race anymore. They developed amnesia and color blindness. Nonsense. It was useful to see race when it benefited these purveyors of racism, and now it's useful to pretend like they don't see race and to deny race because it benefits them and it avoids accountability and feelings of discomfort for them. And so racism denialism is itself a form of racism. Now, the second defense of purveyors of racial injustice is deflection. What about this? What about that? So once they've realized that they're on weak ground and they cannot defend, like what Renaldo Gouws said in that video, they suddenly start pointing fingers everywhere else to try and muddy the waters and to try and confuse people into saying that if you want to condemn racism, or if you want to convict a racist in a court, you also have to talk about everything else that's happened in society before you get there. No. Not what about this, not what about that. What about racism? What about racial inequality? What about where people live in South Africa? What about the job market? What about the racial structure of the economy? What about apartheid? What about colonialism? What about slavery? What about Penny Sparrow? What about Adam Katsavelos? If you really want to play the what about game, we can play the what about game, but you're not going to come out on the right side of the what about game. Because I'm going to continue to ask you, what about your parents? What about all the people who served in the apartheid army who are still living their best lives in South African society? What about all those people who voted for apartheid? What about the wealth that is in your bank account and in your savings account and in your portfolio that you inherited from a system of racial dispossession? What about Bantu education? What about the Group Areas Act? What about the Native Land Act? What about that? So don't give me this whataboutery whenever a racial question comes about, because I will ask you what about. And if you don't have answers for what about that, then please don't tell me what about this. And even when this question of what about happens whenever someone is racist, it's extremely disingenuous, because the usual scarecrow is, what about Julius Malema? What about Julius Malema? Let's actually talk about your what about, because your what about doesn't make sense. Julius Malema sang the song Kill the Boer, and he was taken to court. And the court first declared it hate speech, Judge Lamont's judgment in the High Court many years ago. I think it was around 2011. So what about is that the person you're talking about actually was taken to court And then AfriForum and Julius Malema and the ANC Youth League at the time came to an agreement that the song wouldn't be called hate speech, but it wouldn't be sung. They would sing a different kind of song. And then that was where it ended. So what about that? I don't understand how that exonerates someone calling for the murder of black people outside of an artistic context, outside of a struggle history song, just saying it to try and prove some kind of misguided point. So the what about doesn't make any sense. What happened with the Kill the Boer song after that? When the EFF started singing it again, because of the agreement, they went to court again. They were taken to court. And guess what? They won the case this time. Judge Molahlehi ruled that this was to be seen in its proper historical context, which it should be, the song. And so they went to court. There was accountability, there was a legal process, and if you disagree with the legal process, I thought you were also an advocate of the rule of law. So which one is it? Does the rule of law apply, or does it only apply when it serves your narrow agenda? It went to the Supreme Court of Appeal, which upheld the ability to sing that song in an appropriate context. And it may well go to the Constitutional Court. So there is a legal process around which this song is being treated in the South African democracy. And that process must be respected. But to compare that to Renaldo Gouws jumping on a video and calling for the murder of all black people using the most execrable language is quite frankly delusional and just contemptuous. So racism denialism is just quite frankly sad. Whataboutery is nonsensical. But then there's this attempt to make it impossible to call someone racist unless they do the most execrable thing. So you can only use the term racist when someone has actually used the K word or the N word, and anything else is never racist. And this was the trap into which many people fell before Renaldo Gouws was finally exposed for these terrible comments. We can't have such a high bar in such a racist society with such a racist history. We cannot have an impossible bar for racism where nobody can ever be accused of racism unless they use the K word and call for the murder of black people. Because what you do is that you then allow racism to go underground and you allow people to say racist things which they mean as racist and which have racist consequences, but which they hide behind on which they hide behind the ambiguity of their statements. And so racism is a far more complex phenomenon than just people using racist words. It's a structural phenomenon, it's an economic phenomenon, it's an educational phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that often doesn't even need human agency. Once you implant it in a society, it can self-perpetuate itself. It can self-perpetuate even without people continuing to exercise racist language. So those who support racists, even if they're not saying these terrible words, are complicit. Those who deny racism are complicit. Those who deflect from racism are complicit. And they need to know that and be made to know that. They can be racist in their private spaces if it really makes them happy, but to come into society and try to replicate that racism, well, that's when society needs to fight back, quite frankly. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. The final defense is that it happened a long time ago. This is interesting to me. Firstly, 16 years or even 2010 is not a long time ago. Okay, so should we forget the 2010 World Cup? Should we erase all economic data that is older than 16 years or 20 years? Jacob Zuma, another scarecrow of racists who use Jacob Zuma and his corruption to try to deflect from questions about racial accountability. Jacob Zuma is in court right now in a trial for corruption allegations which occurred 20 plus years ago. So should that case be dropped? Because it happened a long time ago. State capture and the Zondo Commission dealt with evidence that emerged from 2012. So should we excuse all of that because it happened a long time ago? So I don't get what constitutes a long time ago and when we use it. Because when we talk about black politicians, then our memories extend infinitely. But when we talk about white racism, then we have very short memories. Either history and things that happened in the past matter, or they don't, but we can't be selective about it. So you need to decide, do you agree with things that happened a long time ago or don't you? But then you need to be consistent about it. The fact of the matter is, yes, people do make mistakes, and yes, human beings are not all perfect. But there are certain mistakes that are so egregious that even if they happened a long time ago, accountability is still required for them. We're not talking about a minor indiscretion or a lapse in judgment here, or execrable language. We're talking about one of the most evil things that has ever happened in the world: the imposition of colonialism and apartheid on black South Africans. And unfortunately, we can't have infinite tolerance for this kind of evil because we've seen how it has destroyed so many millions of lives, so many millions of families, and many generations. And it's still with us today. So no, the "it happened a long time ago" does not apply either. So, in general, South Africans from all races who care about racial equality, I really think need to come together in this moment and make sure that the cause of the noble cause, the noble fight for racial equality and racial justice in South Africa is not pushed to the back burner. I'm not saying that every conversation has to be about race everywhere and at all times. I'm saying that we cannot lose the conversation about racial equality. We cannot lose it just because we want to talk about service delivery, which, by the way, has racial dimensions. We cannot lose it just because we want to talk about the economy, which, by the way, has racial dimensions. We can't lose it just because we want to talk about the stability of governance. We have to always be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to keep questions of racial equality front and center. Not because they're economically useful or because they're useful from a policy or governance perspective, but because it's the right thing to do. You know, some things are just important because they're the right thing to do, quite apart from whether they have positive or negative economic consequences. Keeping racism front and center of our conversation in the goal of making this a truly equal society is just right. Never mind whether it's desirable, which it also is. And we need a society in which there is accountability, and I want to shout out all the South Africans who made sure, from social media to the Human Rights Commission now, to other people who have taken people who commit racist speech to court for crimen injuria, even to the government and people like John Jeffrey, who was the Deputy Minister of Justice, who has really worked hard on racial hate crimes legislation. And I think that's a great step forward. To create a legal infrastructure where accountability for racism is a thing. And we need to continue to make sure, and I think we need more institutions. We need more voices in the media. And this is where I speak to the vast majority of South Africans who maybe feel uncomfortable or scared to talk about racism. Raise your voice. Those of us who care about racial equality are the vast majority, and we mustn't be made to feel as if we're in some minority by a weird network of minority voices who happen to have a loud hailer and think that they can dominate the discourse. And legal accountability, I think we need more civil society institutions that take racism seriously and are not just talking about racial dialogues and racial conversations. Yeah, that's important, but racial justice matters too. Where are the civil society organizations pushing land reform, pushing anti-racist legislation, anti-racist cases before the Constitutional Court, developing our Constitution as a truly anti-racist document? If that is what it truly is, then let's see it for what it truly is. And in the media landscape, we know that white voices dominate South African English-speaking journalism. They must firstly make space for more voices, because there's an apartheid culture in journalism where the highest editorial ranks and the ownership structures are often still representative of a past era, where the focus on Black politicians, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be accountability, by the way. There should be. There should be scrutiny on everyone who holds public power. There should be scrutiny on opposition politicians. If they say unwise things or if they participate in corruption, full scrutiny. I don't have a problem with scrutiny. I have a problem with selective scrutiny. When you demand ultimate accountability from one group of people, but impunity is expected from a whole other group. And I think the South African media has an important role to play in keeping questions of racial equality and racial justice front and center of our public conversation, in addition to transforming the South African media landscape, which I'm afraid often makes the DA look like a bastion of racial representation. When you go into some of these newsrooms, the high editorial echelons, let alone the ownership structures, you will see a picture that is worrying, terrifying, and reminiscent of the past era. And unfortunately, the journalists who write for these publications don't want to talk about that either. But that's a story for another day. So I know that after making a video like this, there will be a network of people who will try to twist my words, make it seem as though I'm advocating for something that I'm not advocating, try to paint me as some kind of agent for one or other political agenda, try to call me a racist because I raise questions of racial inequality. I know that that's going to happen. But I don't pay attention to that noise, because I know for every one person who tries to distort this message, there are 10,000 people who are nodding along and who are like, thank you for saying that. Thank you for using this platform. And it's those people I speak to. And that vast majority must always remember that we are a majority, and we have a responsibility to use our voices to speak for that majority. And we should continue to defend people on social media who speak for that majority. And I appreciate the way in which this audience is honest and open, and it can call out what needs to be called out, but it will always stand on the right side of history, the right side of equality, and the right side of justice. Thank you for watching this episode of SMWX. And all I can say is that if Renaldo Gouws had to disappear from South African politics, no one would notice. Aye.